Kia ora and welcome to chapter 2 of this book. And what we're looking at in this chapter here is how the brain actually learns. And what we want to do is we want to complement the sociology and the psychology of learning with the neuroscience of learning. And so over the last 15 years we've been looking into how the brain actually learns from a neuroscientific perspective. Most people are aware that their brains have got neurons. And that is true. We have a significant number of the cells in our brains are neurons. But there are other cells as well. But there's also some problems in neuroscience. We find it very hard from a neuroscientific perspective to actually even count the number of cells in our brain. So that is actually up for debate, let alone actually the components, what types of cells are in our brain. But what we have been looking at is what are the systems, the learning systems that we use in our brain. Early on in the process we started to look at memory associated with that, and we started to realise that in fact the brain more than likely had more than one learning system. And in the end we've come up with a model of 4 different learning systems, and we're going to unpack these in more detail later on. But for the moment those 4 learning systems from birth are our first thing we have to learn when we're first born, is to sense the world. So when we're first born we don't actually know where the sounds we're hearing are coming from. We've got to actually learn people's moving mouths producing sounds. That's where I need to sort of focus on. And we need to be able to sense where's that heat coming from. Balance is another one. Okay, so we've got 23 senses, not 5. And so our sensory system is really complex, and it produces a stream of data to tell the inside of our head, our brain, what is happening on the outside of our head, the world. And that needs to be learnt. And so if we spend most of our first few months looking at how to manage our sensory system. Our second learning system is our ability to sequence. And this gives us the capacity to learn to speak. Part of our capacity to learn to speak is biologically inherited from our parents, and from their parents, and from their parents, and back down our genetic line. But also what we learn is how to sequence the movements of the mouth and the tongue and to copy that. So what we want to do as young people, we want baby looking at mother, caregiver, and we want them to be able to see their mouths and see how the mouth and the tongue move. And we naturally use baby language, which accentuates the modelling of how the mouth moves and how the tongue is placed. So our second learning system is sequencing. We're going to come back to sequencing later on because we've made an adaptation to that as well. Our third learning system is our ability to form ideas and concepts, and this is something only human beings can do. We're the only species that can create new ideas and new concepts on the fly. And that underpins our fourth learning system, which is our ability to be creative. Creativity is once again uniquely human. Elephants painting pictures are not being creative. They're not doing it with intent, and they're not doing it with purpose. They're just splashing paint on a piece of paper. Right? So human beings have all 4 learning systems. Some species most species have the first learning system, and that is to be able to sense their world. Some species have the second one, to sequence, and so they'll sequence different processes. They'll also sequence to be able to speak in very, very simplistic tones and signals. So our first learning system and our second learning system we share with others. Our third and fourth we don't. And we don't share that with others because what our brain does is it goes through a huge shift in how it's composed. So when we're first born, in order to do that sequencing and in order to do that sensing our world, we need lots of neurons. And so those neurons actually dominate our brain. As we get to later in life, between 8 to 10 years old, there's a transition. And the transition is from mostly neurons to mostly another type of cell type called astrocytes, which is a form of glial cell. And astrocytes then allow us to map those patterns, allow us to form ideas and concepts. So when you are young, we're not very good at forming ideas and concepts. And that's why for 5 and 6 year olds at school, 3, 4, 5, 6 year olds, we have lots of rules. And the rules are very contextual. We tell them exactly what to do and when to do it and what context to do that in. Later on in life, people are able to make broad concepts in their minds, but that's because those neurons have actually morphed into astrocytes over time. And it's very debatable at the moment as to what the percentages are. We don't actually know, but what we do know is we've got a very different human being when they're first born in terms of their brain and later on in life. And we'll talk more about that later on in this series. So describing learning requires definitions, and in this chapter we deal particularly with the definitions. We need to be able to know what the difference between an idea and a concept is. And if you think about it yourself, can you actually delineate the difference between an idea and a concept? Or can you delineate the difference between imagination and creativity? Because they're two very different words. But in our profession to date, we haven't been very good at defining those. So in the book, we've defined those terminologies. And those are the terminologies we need to use in our classrooms on a daily basis with children. Okay? So they need to understand, because increasingly, as Art talked about in the preface to the book, we need to actually make them able to manage their own learning. And this is this whole notion of giving children agency over their learning, so they have control over their learning. So pop in and read chapter 2 of the book, and then we'll come back to you and talk to you later about chapter 3. Thanks very much.